Chaf Hey Amud Aleph will begin Daf Chaf Dalad Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. We learned previously Machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. They did the Koirel, the pious. The question was, the Machlokes was, which begotten were the Kohanim dressed with? Rav Nachman says they wore Big Day Chol, and Rav Sheshes says they wore Big Day Kodesh. Amar Rav Nachman, Minna Amin Allah, what's my raya that they wore Big Day Chol? This nan we learn in the Mishnah, Masrun l'chazonim, after the Geirel, the Kohanim are handed over to the Chazonim, the attendants, V'hayu mafshitin oisen as Big Day, and they removed the clothing that they were wearing. They removed the clothing of the Kohanim, and they left them only with their pants. So my love by since pious, it doesn't mean for those who were zochah pious that were won the Geirel, that therefore they were going to do the avodah, and now it doesn't that mean that they had to change the clothing and now put on Big Day Kahuna to do the avodah. So doesn't that show you that the Geirel was done, the pious was done with Big Day Chol? Amar Bar Yehuda Amar Sheshes, he says no. What it means is that for the ones who did not win the Geirel, who did not win the pious was done the Big Day Kodesh. Now after the pious was completed, the ones who did not win, who are not going to do the avodah, now they had to change the clothes into Big Day Chol. And Hachanami Mistaber, it's Mistaber to say that the Isal Kedaitach Boys and Shazachal pious, because if it's going to if it means like you're suggesting that it's for the ones who Zachal pious, who won the Geirel, and now that they have to change into Big Day Kodesh, Big Day Kahuna, so what does it mean? What does it mean that they only left their Mechnasaim? According to that, your interpretation, it would mean to say that they left them with their Mechnasaim of the Big Day Chol, then they removed the other clothing, put on the Big Day Kahuna, and after that they changed their Mechnasaim from the Big Day Chol to the Big Day Kodesh. But that can't be, because Vatanya, we learned in the Bryce Minayin Shlo, you had Davar Kahuna Mechnasaim. How do we know when the Kohen puts on his Big Day Kahuna that nothing should precede the Mechnasaim? The pants have to be the first ones that he puts on. Talmud Leimer, Umechnasei Vad Yal Besorai. It has a Mechnei B'sei Vad on his Basar, meaning that's the first thing that's on his Basar is the Mechnasaim. So it can't be the way you're suggesting it, because the way you're suggesting it is the Mechnasaim was he changed into the Mechnasaim of the Big Day Kahuna only after putting on the other begonim. The Idach, now how would Rav Nachman learn this? How would he understand it? The Idach, Halei Kasha, Hachiktane. And Sha'oidin Aleim Big Day Chol, what it means is he would interpret it as follows. It means while they were still wearing the Big Day Chol, Malbishan Oisan Mechsei Kodesh. While they were still wearing their Big Day Chol, they changed their pants. They changed the pants into the Mechsei Kodesh. Then Vahayu Mafshit Nois Big Day Chol. Then they removed the other Big Day Chol. And at that point, all that they were wearing were pants, the pants that were the Big Day Kodesh, and then they put on the rest of the begonim. Amar Rav Sheshes, Rav Sheshes says, what's my raya that the Kohanim wore Big Day Kodesh at the time of the Geirel? The Sanya, it says in the Brisa, Lishkas Abgozis, the Lishkas Agozis come in Besilki Gedol Haisa. It was a large chamber, and it was a large chamber that, as some Meforshim say, Meiri says it was also a tall chamber. Kamin Basilka Gedailah was like a large basilica. Pious b'Mizrach, the Geirel was done on the eastern side of it. On the eastern side of this basilica, that's where they had the Geirel. V'Zaken Yoshev Ma'arava, and the Zaken was sitting in the west side of it. The Zaken, he was sitting there on the west side, that's where he sat, and he was overseeing the Geirel, and he was sitting in the west. And the Kohanim stood in a circle like a brooch, a woman's jewelry, a brooch that's in the shape of a circle. and the mamuna comes, the minister comes, and he removes the hat from one of the Kahanim, v'yaidim shemimena pious maskon. People would know that's where the pious starts from. The number, the counting starts from that kayan. Now, if you're going to tell me that it was done b'big dechol, mitznefes b'big dechol mika, it says they took off the mitznefes. The Masechet isn't b'big dechol. It must be that they were wearing big day kodesh. The Gemara says no, there was a mitznefes in big dechol. Kedatan Rav Yuna v'Tamer Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Kayin sh'alsa sala imay kutaines ayim ba'avodas yachid. He is allowed to use it an avodas yachid, not an avodas tzibor, but he's allowed to use it a avodas yachid. So meaning they had the some of the mothers of the Kahanim wanted to glorify the avodah and to show the chashivas of the avodah, and they had a desire to be menadev for the big nekuna. So if the Kohen whose mother made a katainus for him, and as Rashem says, she donated it to the Gizbar, she donated it to Hekdesh. She made that katainus for the Kohen. He could wear that only for an avodas yachid, not for avodas tzibur. For the avodas tzibur, it had to come from the lishka. It had to come from the money of Hekdesh. But if there was common practice that the kind that the mother made a kataina to show the chavivis of the big day kahuna and the veda of the kahuna, he could use that for a avodas yachid. Over here for the gairo, they could be wearing that type of those type of begonim. Therefore, since this type of a big day begonim were not suitable for the karbonas sibor, they were not suitable for the talmid. Therefore, there was not a concern that the Kayan would use it for the avodah. Therefore, the gairo could be done with these type of begonim. So that's what it means over here. He says over here that Rav Nachman will say that it's not a raya that there's big day kahuna. It's talking about this type of a mitznefes. Now we have to mention the lishkas hagozes. The Gemara now is going to have a detailed discussion of the lishkas hagozes. We learn from here that lishkas hagozes, that the lishkas hagozes, chetzi b'kodesh, chetzi b'chol. Half of it was built in the kodesh, and half of it was built in the area that was chol. Half of it was built in the area of the azora, and half of it outside the azora. And you can learn out further that it had two doorways. Now, why do we say that? So, because Gemara explains, the Isal Kedaita Kula B'Kodesh, if you would say that it's Kula B'Kodesh, meaning it would have the Kedusha of the Azora, how could that be? A Zokin Yeshiv Ma'arova, it says that the Zokin that was overseeing it, he would sit in the west side. How can that be? V'Hamar Mar and Yeshiva Ba'Azora El Malka Beis Dovid Bulvad. You're not allowed to sit in the Azora. It's only for the king, the Malka Beis Dovid, that's allowed to sit in the Azora. So that must mean that it did not have the Kedusha of the Azora. Now, if you're going to say that it was built completely in the area which was Chol, Payas B'Mizracha, that the Payas should be, it was in the east, how can that be? You need B'Veis Elokim Nalach B'Ragesh, and have to be in an area which had the Kedusha of Azara, that B'Veis Elokim, that we walk with excitement, we go with excitement. So it had to be in the area that had Kedusha of Azara, V'Leka, and this would not be the case if it would be Kula B'Chol. Elish Mami, no, you must learn out from here, Chetzi B'Kodesh, V'Chetzi B'Chol. You must learn out that half of it was built B'Kodesh, half of it was built B'Chol. Now, so that's point number one. But furthermore, but if you would say that it had only one doorway, and that one doorway was open to the Kodesh, but nevertheless, if it had only one doorway and it was open to Kodesh, even if it was built half in the Kodesh and half in the Chol, but if it was only one doorway open to the Kodesh, Zaken Yeshiv Ma'arava, how could the Zaken sit on the west side? Valtanan, Halish Kodesh, Havanois B'Chol, Upsuch LaKodesh, Alishka, that was, even if it was built in the Chol, but if it entered into the Kodesh, if it opened into the area that is Kodesh, Tayachan Kodesh, we consider the interior area to be Kodesh. So therefore, you would not be able to sit there. Now, again, if it only had one doorway and Visal Gedaitach Pesuach L'chol, and if it had only one doorway and that was Pesuach L'chol, again, that would the opening of the doorway would govern the identity of the lishka. Then Payas B'Mizrach, how can you have the Payas B'Mizrach? Then it would be, if it would be open, one doorway open l'chol, it would be considered to be chol. How can you have the Payas B'Mizrach, V'atanan, B'Nuis B'Chol Kodesh, U'Psuchas l'chol? A lishka that was, even if it was built because, but it was open l'chol, Tzaychan chol. It's chol. Ella lav shma minah. Now, therefore, what we see over here, that the Lishkas Hagazit had, half of it was considered to be Kaidish, half of it was Chol. It had two parts to it. It was both Kaidish and both Chol. It was considered part of it to be Chol, and that's why you were able to sit there, but part of it was Kaidish. That's how you can do the Goyrel over, the pious over there. Must be, Elalah Shema Mino Shnei Psochim Hailo, Echad Pasuch B'Kaidish, Ve'echad Pasuch L'Chol, and one was L'Chol. So, to demonstrate, if we say that this is the north half of it, this is the north half of it, and this is considered to be outside the Kedushas Azora. This is considered to be in the area of the Harabayis, not the Azora. The Azora, the Kedushas Azora starts here, was half. It was built half on the south side, which was Kaidish, half on the north side was Chol. Furthermore, it had to have two psochim. It had to have two areas, one in the east and one in the west. So it had to have one Pesach in the west. The Pesach in the west over here, therefore, is on the Pesach on the west and on the north side. Therefore, we say that the area that it's open to is Chol. So therefore, the area to the west is considered to be Chol, because the doorway that is on the opened to the west is on the north side, so the west side is Chol, because it's Psuch L'Chol. The area to the south, the doorway is, the area to the south over here, the doorway is to the east. So therefore, the entire east area is considered to be Kodesh, because the doorway is open to the area of the Azora on the south side, which is Kodesh. So it had to have those two features. Now the Meir explains, you can't say that it was Suach to the Kodesh, entirely in the Kodesh, entirely in the Chol, rather that it was built entirely in the Kodesh, or entirely in the Chol, and had two Psochim, because if it had two Psochim, the area that would be built in, it would govern, that would override the area of the two Psochim. If it had only one Pesach, it's Benuyis L'Kodesh, Benu L'Chol L'Chol. But if it has two Psachim, then we would say that since it is built, whatever the area is built in, the Pesach that is opened, if it's the same area to which it's built in, that would override the other Pesach that it's open to another area. So for instance, if it was entirely built B'Kodesh, but it had two Psachim, one that was in B'Kodesh and one was B'Chol, even though it had one Pesach that was open to the Chol, but since if it had been built entirely B'Kodesh, and it had a Pesach that's open to the Kodesh, that would override the Pesach that's B'Chol, it would be considered entirely Kodesh, and vice versa. So therefore, it has to be that it's half built B'Kodesh, half built B'Chol. It has two Psachim, one built B'Kodesh, and one built B'Chol. This explains that when we say that the Psuchas L'Kodesh is L'Kodesh, we don't mean that it's completely like the Kedushas Hazor, but it has an element of the Kedushas Hazor, but it doesn't have all of the halachas of the Kedushas Hazor. This is the kasha that if we say that we need the Goyrel to be done in the Azora because of Beis Elokim Nahalach B'Ragesh, why wasn't it done in the Azora? Why did we do it in the Lishkas Hagazis? This explains two teruts, and one teretz is because we take off the hat of the Kohen. It's not coveted to do it in the Azara. Second teretz is, it gives over there, is because they sat in a circle. If they sat in a circle, then part of them, half of them would be in their backs to the Kodesh Kadoshim, which is not coveted. So therefore, they did it in the Lishka, not in the Azara. The Meir explains further that we said that its half was built in the north, which was Bechol, half B'Kodesh. The doorway that was to the west was in the north, which is Bechol. So the entire west part is considered to be Bechol. Why did they choose that the west part is Bechol and the east part is Kodesh? Because the west part was Chol, they could sit there. The Sanhedrin sat. The Sanhedrin sat there. Now we wanted the Sanhedrin who paskin the Shailas to be as close to the Kodesh Kadoshim as possible. So that's why we made the west half of it Chol. They could sit there, which the west half was closer to the Kodesh Kadoshim. So the Mishnah Pais Sheni, the second girl, is Mishoichet, who does the shlit of the Talmud, Mizorik, who does the Rikas Adam, Mimedashim Mizbeach Hapnimi, who clears the ashes out from the Mizbeach Hapnimi, from the Mizbeach Hazov, the inner Mizbeach. Umimedashan es menorah, who clears the ashes from the menorah. Umimala evorim lekevesh, and who brings up the evorim to the kevesh. They brought first the evorim of the Talmud that were going to be burnt on the Mizbeach to the kevesh, to the ramp, and from the ramp to the Mizbeach. So who brings up the limbs to the ramp? What are the limbs? HaRosh v'HaRegel, the head and the right hind leg. Ushnei Yadayim, and the two forelegs. Va'oiketz v'HaRegel, and the tail and the left hind leg. V'chazav v'gera, and the chazav, the chest and the neck. Ushte adfonais, and the two sides of them, two flanks. V'hakravayim, and the intestines. And next is v'hasoilas, and the fine flour. They were makriv with the korban atomid was the minchas nesachim. It had fine flour, and there's minchas nesachim that was with oil. So that was also burnt on the mizbeach, and it was brought also at that time. Who was zeicha to that? Chavitim, and the chavitim was the mincha of the kohen gadol. That was a minchas machvas. That's what's called chavitim. Who nekaris, that was offered. That was brought at the same time as the talmud. Who brings up the chavitim, v'hayayin, and the wine for the nesachim. They had the nesachim with the talmud. Nesachim consists of the fine flour with oil and wine. So next is the wine. Shleishas v'kahanim zachaboy. So there was a total of 13 kahanim that were zaycha to bring up the different parts of the talmud and what accompany the talmud. Amr ben Lazar lifnei Rabbi Kiva Shem Rabbi Yeshua derech hiluch hayakarav. It was not. This was not the order. It was order. The order was in the way the animal walks. That's the way the limbs were severed and they were apportioned and brought up to the kevesh. So we'll see in the Gemara what is the chilek between them. What is the difference in the order of the way it was brought up to the kevesh between these two shitas. So the Gemara iboilahu kishehin mefaisin lavoida achn mefaisin oidim lachol avoida vavoida hem mefaisin. Do they do a separate gyro? Meaning, do they do a separate gyro for mishaych, who gets the shlit, then a whole separate gyro for who does the zrika, then a whole separate gyro, etc., etc., or do they do a gyro and they say, okay, mishaych, the one who's shaykhet, and then you go in an order. For the 13 kahanim, each one you go to the right of the sheikhet, to the right of the zayrik, to the right of him, and you just follow along automatically, and you follow one after each other. Do you do a separate goyrel for each one of these, or do you say you do one goyrel, the first one that's zaycha, and the rest of them follow to the right of this first one that's zaycha? Tashma, let's bring a raya. Arba payasas hayusham. The Mishnah said that there were 4 goyrels. Navi salkadaita l'chol avoda hem mefaisim. If you're going to say that there was a separate goyrel for each avoda, tuvahava, there are much more than 4. Amr of Nachman Yitzchak. No, that's not a raya because hachi kamer. Maybe this is what it's saying. Arba pa'amim nechnasim lahafiz. They assemble 4 times. But there are more goyrels. So but each time they assembled, each time they got together, there were more payasas. Maybe the 4 payasas is only referring to the number of times that they assembled. So Shmuel, let's bring a raya. Rabbi Yehuda Imer loy haya payas lamachta. There was no payas to determine which kohen takes the shovel, the machta, the shovel of coals, into the mizbeach hapnimi for the burning of the ketayros. So there's no gyro for that. Elakain shezacha b'ketayros. The kain that zeicha with the ketayros, that won the girl for the ketayros. He says to the kain that sacked them, zachi mi b'machta. Now you you accompany me with the machta, with the shovel, for the coals, and to bring in the coals for the burning of the ketores. So what do we see from here? That even though there's one girl, and there's not a separate girl for the machta, there's a girl for the ketores, and he says to the one next to him to bring in the machta. And one says, no, it's not a raya, because shiny machta or ketores to charavayim. That there's no separate girl for the machta, because the machta is only to facilitate the burning of the ketores. That's one avaida. But if you're talking about separate avaidas, perhaps I'll tell you that there's separate girls, so there's separate shlit, there's separate kabbalah, there's separate avaidas. So therefore, it's not a raya. We'll continue with discussion through this next Amud.